The winter of 1888 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle descent into slumber, not a quiet blanketing of the prairie. It was a sudden, violent act of conquest. The cold did not knock before it entered. It shattered the lock and kicked in the door. It was a physical presence, a weight that settled in the lungs and an ache that nested deep in the bones. For the settlers scattered across the vast, unforgiving flatness, it was the perennial enemy, the ancient dragon whose breath was frost and whose roar was the ceaseless wind. They fought it with the only weapons they knew, fire and wood. The small, square cabins that dotted the landscape were monuments to a flawed and costly war. Built of green cottonwood and chinked with mud and grass, they were more like sieves than shelters. The wind, a force of pure, malevolent energy, found every crack, every seam, every imperfection. It sliced through the walls like a knife, turning the air inside frigid and hostile. Families spent their days in a frantic, losing battle, feeding their cast-iron stoves a constant diet of precious timber, only to watch the heat get stolen away the moment it was born. Frost grew on the inside of the walls, delicate, beautiful patterns of ice that were signatures of failure. It bloomed in the corners and crept across the floorboards from the base of the northern walls. Children coughed a dry, hacking cough that echoed in the small, cramped rooms, their breath pluming in the air even as they huddled near the glowing stove. The settlers of the small community of Prairie Ridge understood this struggle as a fact of life, an unavoidable hardship of their chosen existence. They saw it not as a problem of design, but as a testament to their own endurance. They were strong because they survived it, and they believed the only answer to a harder winter was a bigger woodpile. This shared suffering forged a bond between them, but it also forged a rigid and unyielding tradition. They built as their fathers had, and as their neighbors did. A house was a box with 4 walls, a roof, a door, and windows to let in the light. To suggest otherwise was to question the very foundation of their collective experience, to imply that their hardship was not merely endured, but invited. The problem was universal, a shared misery that was accepted with a grim, Protestant stoicism. They chopped more wood, stuffed more rags into the cracks, and told themselves that spring would eventually come. They were wrong about the nature of their problem. The cold was not the enemy. Their own stubborn ignorance was. Into this world of hardened tradition and accepted suffering came Ilara. She was a widow, a quiet woman whose presence in the community was tolerated more than it was welcomed. Her husband, a German engineer named Klaus, had been killed 2 years prior, a victim of a railroad trestle collapse he himself had designed. The irony was a cruel one, and it left Ilara isolated, wrapped in a cloak of quiet grief and foreignness. She spoke with a slight accent, and her ways were not their ways. Where they were pragmatic and physical, she was pensive and methodical. Her most prized possessions were not quilts or cast-iron pans, but a crate of her late husband's books and notebooks, filled with dense German script, precise diagrams, and the arcane language of physics and thermodynamics. After surviving her second winter in the flimsy cabin Klaus had built for them upon their arrival, a winter that had nearly claimed her youngest child, Leo, with a fever born of the relentless chill, Ilara made a decision. She would not endure another season like that. She would not spend another winter watching her children shiver under a mountain of blankets, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. She would build a new house, not a cabin, but a house. And she would build it according to the principles she had spent the last year deciphering from her husband's meticulous notes. She walked to the fledgling lumber mill at the edge of the settlement, a place run by a man named Silas. He was the community's de facto builder, a large man with a booming voice and hands as tough and calloused as old leather. He had built nearly half the structures in Prairie Ridge, and his work was considered the standard of quality. Ilara stood before him, a small, determined figure, and laid out her plan. She did not ask for his help in building, only for the lumber. But she had to explain the design to get the right cuts. Her idea was simple in its core principles, but radical in its execution. She described a foundation of fieldstone, dug 5 feet into the earth to touch the stable warmth of the deep ground. She spoke of 2 parallel frames for the walls, creating a cavity nearly 2 feet thick that she intended to pack with a mixture of sod, straw, and sawdust. She described a long, low-profile roof on the north side, angled like a ramp to encourage the wind to slide over it, rather than batter against it. And then she delivered the detail that stopped Silas in his tracks. "There will be no windows on the north wall," she said, her voice calm and steady. "None at all. The largest windows will face south to drink the winter sun." Silas stared at her for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and then to outright amusement. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, then erupted into a full-throated laugh. The other men in the yard stopped their work to listen. "No north windows?" he boomed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Woman, that's the foolishest thing I've ever heard. A house needs to see in all directions. It needs to breathe. You'll build a dark, damp tomb, not a home for your children." The mockery spread through the community like a prairie fire. The men at the general store leaned against the counter and joked about the widow's folly and her German dirt house. They called it a bunker, a root cellar fit for potatoes, not people. Some speculated that her grief had finally unsettled her mind. The women of the settlement were kinder, but their pity was almost worse than the men's scorn. They would stop by her small plot of land, where she had begun to mark out the foundation, and offer gentle, misguided advice. "A window there would give you the morning light, dear," one would say. "You'll want to see who's coming up the road," another would insist. They warned her of the darkness, of the dampness that would surely rot the walls from the inside out. They spoke of stale air and sickness. Their words were meant to be helpful, a chorus of concern rooted in the deep soil of their shared tradition. But to Ilara, it was just noise. It was the sound of people who had become so accustomed to their suffering that they could not imagine a world without it. They mistook their endurance for wisdom. She held her husband's notebooks, the crisp pages filled with calculations of thermal mass and solar orientation, and she trusted the quiet, elegant logic of physics over the loud, confident voice of popular opinion. The community's skepticism was a second kind of winter, a social cold that sought to freeze her ambition. But she had a fire inside her, a quiet, determined flame fueled by the memory of her son's labored breathing in the frozen air of their old cabin. She would not let it go out. She began the work alone. The first task was the foundation, and it was the most brutal. She drove the spade into the hard-packed prairie soil, her slight frame straining with each shovelful. The earth was stubborn, a dense mat of grass roots and clay that fought her every inch of the way. Day after day she dug, her hands blistering, then callousing. Her back ached with a fire that never seemed to cool. The hole grew slowly, an expanding rectangle of dark, rich soil that seemed to swallow the morning sun. The people of Prairie Ridge would pass by on the road, shaking their heads at the sight of the lone woman toiling in the dirt. They saw a desperate, foolish act. Ilara saw the beginning of a sanctuary. After 2 weeks of relentless labor, she had excavated a trench 5 feet deep. She could no longer do the work alone. She used a small portion of her meager savings to hire 2 young men, brothers who were new to the territory and desperate for any work they could find. They were strong and willing, but they knew nothing of building. This suited Ilara perfectly. They brought muscle, but she brought the mind. She directed them to the fields, where they gathered hundreds of fieldstones, the glacial debris that littered the landscape. Under her watchful eye, they began to lay the foundation, fitting the stones together like a complex puzzle. She did not use the common mud mortar, but a mixture of clay, sand, and lime she prepared herself. A formula from one of Klaus's books. It was a slow, painstaking process. Each stone was chosen for its shape, each gap filled with precision. While Ilara and her hired hands meticulously laid the groundwork for her fortress against the cold, Silas and his crew were erecting a new cabin for a newly arrived family just a quarter-mile down the road. Their work was a study in contrast. They worked with speed and familiar efficiency. The clang of their hammers was a constant, confident rhythm on the prairie air. They raised the thin, single-frame walls in a matter of days. They cut window openings on all four sides, symmetrical and traditional. They finished the entire structure in 3 weeks, a testament to their experience and the proven, if flawed, method. The community saw this as the proper way of things. Silas was a builder, a man of action. Ilara was a dreamer, a woman lost in her strange ideas, digging a hole in the ground while a real house went up nearby. Her slow, deliberate pace was seen as further evidence of her folly. The true innovation, however, began when the foundation was complete and the double frame for the walls went up. The gap between the inner and outer walls was enormous, a full 20 inches of empty space. The mockery from the onlookers grew louder. "Are you building a house or a corn crib?" one man shouted from his wagon. Ilara ignored him. She began the most tedious phase of the construction, the insulation. She had spent the summer gathering her materials. She cut thick bricks of sod from the prairie, letting them bake in the sun until they were dry and hard. She hauled sawdust by the cartload from Silas's mill, paying for it with what little she had left. She mixed these with straw, creating a dense, dry aggregate. Layer by painstaking layer, she and the 2 boys packed the cavity between the walls. A layer of sod bricks fitted tightly, then a thick packing of the sawdust and straw mixture, tamped down until it was firm. Then another layer of sod. It was slow, dusty, monotonous work. She explained the principle to the boys, not in the language of physics, but in simple, practical terms. "The cold is a thief," she told them, her hands dusty with soil. "It wants the heat from our stove. A thin wall is a thin door with a bad lock. The thief gets through easily. This," she said, patting the thick, solid wall, "is a vault. It is too thick, too heavy for the thief to break. The heat stays inside with us, where it belongs." The walls rose slowly, not as a wooden frame, but as a solid earthen monolith clad in timber. It was less a construction and more a geological formation, growing from the ground itself. The winter that followed was not merely a winter, it was a legend. It would be spoken of for generations, a benchmark against which all other hardships were measured. They would call it the Winter of the Blue Snow, or the Great Stillness, because on the coldest days, the air became so dense with ice crystals, it shimmered with a pale blue light, and all sound seemed to die, frozen in the throat of the world. It began in November with a blizzard that buried the territory under 3 feet of snow, and it never truly let up. The storms were followed by waves of Arctic air that descended from the north like an invading army. Temperatures plummeted to 30, then 40 degrees below zero, and stayed there for weeks on end. The wind was a constant, scouring force that sculpted the snow into massive, frozen waves and drove the cold into every living thing. For the people of Prairie Ridge, it was a catastrophe. The traditional methods, which had been barely adequate in a normal winter, now failed completely and catastrophically. The green wood of their cabins shrank in the extreme cold. opening up new cracks and gaps in the walls. The mud chinking froze and crumbled, falling away in chunks and allowing the wind to pour in. The cabins became iceboxes, brittle shells that offered little more protection than a tent. The endless labor of feeding the stove became a desperate life-or-death struggle. Wood piles that were meant to last the entire winter were gone by January. Families burned everything they could: fence posts, furniture, old crates. The new cabin Silas had built with such speed and confidence was one of the worst. The family living there abandoned the main room entirely, sealing it off with blankets and huddling together in the small kitchen, their stove glowing red-hot day and night while frost formed on the walls just a few feet away. Inside Ilara's house, the world was different. The great storm arrived not as a roar, but as a deep, muffled hum. The thick, earthen walls absorbed the fury of the wind, dampening its scream to a distant whisper. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white chaos. Inside, there was a profound and unshakable stillness. There were no drafts, not a single one. The air did not move except for the gentle, rising warmth from her small, efficient stove. The floor, laid over the deep stone foundation, was not warm, but it was not cold either. It held a neutral, steady temperature, drawing on the immense thermal battery of the earth beneath it. The genius of her design was revealed in its totality. The low, angled northern roof shed the wind, which scoured the snow up and over the house rather than piling it against a flat wall. The blank, windowless north face presented an impenetrable shield to the coldest front. On the south side, the large, well-sealed windows performed their silent miracle. During the day, even the pale, low-hanging winter sun was enough to cast patches of light onto the dark stone floor. This light, this free energy from the sky, was absorbed by the stone, which then slowly radiated the warmth back into the room long after the sun had set. Her house did not just fight the cold, it collaborated with the environment. It used the earth as an anchor and the sun as an ally. She burned less than half the wood of her neighbors, and her home was twice as warm. Her children played on the floor, their laughter echoing in the calm, warm air. The house was not a tomb, it was an ark. The contrast was absolute, a stark and measurable difference between two realities coexisting on the same frozen patch of prairie. In Silas's home, a structure considered the pinnacle of local craftsmanship, the struggle for survival was a visible, audible thing. A thick blanket nailed over the doorframe billowed and snapped with every gust of wind that breached the defenses. The water bucket in the corner, 10 feet from the stove, was frozen solid. His wife and children were wrapped in every layer they owned, their faces pinched and blue with cold, their movements sluggish. The stove itself was a tyrant, a glowing red beast that demanded constant tribute, its insatiable hunger a source of growing panic as the woodpile dwindled. The heat it produced was aggressive but fleeting, scorching the air in its immediate vicinity while leaving the rest of the room to the mercy of the invading cold. The temperature inside rarely climbed above 40 degrees, and at night it plunged toward freezing. In Ilara's home, less than a mile away, a different world existed. The silence was the first thing a visitor would notice, a deep, enveloping calm that stood in defiant opposition to the howling chaos outside. The warmth was the second. It was not the fierce, dry heat of an overstoked fire, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the house itself. It was an even 60 degrees throughout the single large room. Her children, Leo and Anya, wore simple woolen sweaters and played with carved wooden toys on a braided rug in the center of the floor. There was no frost on the windowsills of the south-facing windows. A small pot of herbs, a luxury she had cultivated from seed, grew on one sill, its green leaves a vibrant, impossible splash of life against the white wasteland outside. Her wood box was still more than half full. The house was not just a shelter, it was a functioning, thriving ecosystem of warmth and peace. Desperation finally broke through the wall of Silas's pride. His youngest daughter had developed the same rattling cough that Ilara so feared, and his wife's face was etched with a terror he had never seen before. He had tried everything he knew, stuffing more rags in the cracks, nailing boards over the north-facing window, building a crude interior wall of blankets, and nothing had worked. The cold was winning. Defeated, humbled, and terrified, he pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool, and trudged through the wind-scoured snow toward the widow's folly. He did not know what he expected to find. Perhaps a woman as desperate as he was, her strange house having failed in some new and unique way. He prepared himself to offer what little help he could. He reached her door, a simple plank affair set deep into the thick wall, and knocked. The sound was flat and dead in the immense, frozen silence. For a moment there was no answer, and a grim thought crossed his mind, that he was too late. Then the latch clicked, and the door swung inward. He was hit not by a blast of frigid air, but by a soft, welcoming wave of warmth. It was a physical shock, so profound and unexpected that he staggered back a step. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the gentle lamplight inside. He saw Ilara, her face calm, and behind her he saw her children playing on the floor. He saw the green plants on the windowsill. He felt the impossibly still, warm air on his frozen cheeks. He stepped inside, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with everything he thought he knew. He looked around the room, his builder's eye taking in the details: the smooth, solid walls, the clean, dry floor. He instinctively looked for the source of the drafts, the telltale signs of the enemy's infiltration, and found none. He looked at her stove, a model smaller than his own, burning with a low, steady flame. It was impossible. His house, built with the best materials and all his skill, was an Arctic tomb. This woman's house, built from books and strange ideas, was a haven. Ilara did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat or offer any word of vindication. Her triumph was quiet, contained in the simple, undeniable reality of the room. She saw the shock and exhaustion on his face, the desperation in his eyes, and her expression was one of empathy, not pride. "Silas," she said, her voice gentle, "come in. Let me get you some coffee." She gestured to a simple wooden chair near the table. The invitation was not a boast, it was an act of grace. He stumbled forward and sank into the chair, the profound, even warmth of the house seeping into his frozen limbs, melting not only the ice in his bones, but the rigid certainty of his own long-held beliefs. He was wrong. It was a simple, devastating, and ultimately liberating truth. He was devastatingly, completely, and dangerously wrong. Silas did not stay long. He drank the hot coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he held the warm mug, and asked a few halting questions. Ilara answered them in simple, direct terms. "The walls hold the heat," she explained, gesturing to the thick, solid structure. "The earth keeps the floor from freezing. The wind cannot get a grip on the north side, so it cannot steal what is inside." He nodded slowly, the concepts landing with the weight of self-evident truth. He left her house and walked back into the biting wind, but the cold felt different now. Before, it had been an act of God, a malevolent force of nature to be endured. Now, he understood it as a problem of physics, a force that could be understood and, with the right knowledge, defeated. He went not to his own home, but to the general store, which served as the town's gathering place. He found a half-dozen men huddled around the pot-bellied stove, their faces grim. he told them what he had seen. At first, they met his words with the same skepticism they had shown Ilara. They thought the cold had gotten to him, that he was feverish or mad. But Silas was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was their builder, the most practical and grounded man among them. His testimony, delivered with the quiet intensity of a convert, could not be easily dismissed. "The house is warm," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Not just by the fire, the whole house. There are no drafts. Her children are playing on the floor. It works." His words planted a seed of doubt in the fertile ground of their desperation. The next day, 2 more men, elders of the community, made the trek to Ilara's home. They returned with the same look of stunned disbelief on their faces. Word began to spread, carried on hushed, awestruck whispers from one freezing cabin to another. The laughter and mockery that had surrounded Ilara's project were replaced by a growing murmur of respect and curiosity. Small, humbled delegations began to arrive at her door. They came not to offer pity or scorn, but to see for themselves. They would step inside, their shoulders hunched against the cold they had carried in with them, and they would stand in the middle of the room, turning slowly, their faces a mixture of wonder and shame. The warmth was undeniable. The proof was absolute. A week after his first visit, Silas returned. He did not come empty-handed. In one hand, he carried a small sack of flour as a gift. In the other, he held a carpenter's pencil and a small, leather-bound notebook. He stood at her door, his large frame seeming to shrink with humility. He looked her in the eye, his own gaze clear and direct. "Ilara," he said, the name no longer a curiosity, but a title of respect. "I was a fool, a proud, stubborn fool. My family is cold. My neighbors are cold. We built wrong because we did not know any better. You do. Teach me." It was a moment that would become a quiet legend in the town's history. The turning point when pride bowed to wisdom. Ilara invited him in and cleared a space on her simple wooden table. She did not hesitate, nor did she ask for anything in return. She saw the sincerity in his request and understood its importance. The knowledge her husband had collected was not meant to be hidden in a book. It was meant to be lived in, to provide shelter and safety. To share it was to honor his memory in the most meaningful way possible. She brought out Klaus's notebooks, the pages filled with his elegant, angular script and intricate drawings. She opened them on the table, the complex equations and German words meaningless to Silas. But Ilara acted as the translator, turning the abstract principles into practical, buildable concepts. She didn't use terms like thermal inertia or passive solar gain. Instead, she drew in the flour Silas had brought her, sketching the shape of the foundation. "The deeper you go, the more you borrow the Earth's strength against the winter," she explained. She showed him diagrams of how the wind flowed over an angled surface compared to how it battered a flat one. She explained that the thick, packed walls acted like a stone heated by the fire, holding the warmth for hours and releasing it slowly, creating an even, gentle heat. Silas listened, his full attention on her words and drawings. He, the master builder, became the humble apprentice. He filled his notebook with sketches, making notes on the proper ratio of clay and sand for the mortar, the ideal thickness of the walls, the precise angle of the northern roof. He asked question after question, not with the intent of challenging her, but with a deep, genuine desire to understand. He was not just learning how to build a different kind of house. He was learning a new way to see the world, a world governed by invisible laws of heat and cold, wind and sun, that could be respected and worked with, rather than simply fought against. When the great winter finally broke and the prairie began to thaw under the hopeful warmth of the spring sun, the landscape of Prairie Ridge began to change. The sound of construction returned, but it was a different sound now. It was not the rapid-fire clang of hammers raising thin frames, but the slow, rhythmic scrape of shovels digging deep into the earth. Under the guidance of Silas, who was now Elara's most fervent disciple, the community began to rebuild. No one built the old way. Families who had the means began new homes from scratch, their foundations dug deep, their walls planned with the thick, insulating cavity. Those who could not afford to build anew began the arduous process of retrofitting their existing cabins. They built thick new walls around the old ones, creating an insulated shell. They tore out their north-facing windows and sealed the openings, adding new, larger windows to the south. The work was slow and difficult, but it was driven by the fresh, stinging memory of the winter they had just survived. The sight of the community working together, sharing knowledge and labor, was a testament to the profound shift that had occurred. They were no longer just a collection of individuals enduring a common hardship. They were a community actively solving a common problem. The houses themselves began to look different, more solid, more grounded, as if they were growing from the land itself rather than just sitting upon it. The story of the warm houses of Prairie Ridge began to travel. A government surveyor, charting new railroad lines, spent a night in one of the newly modified homes during a late spring cold snap. He was astonished by its ability to hold the day's warmth long into the frigid night. He was an educated man, with a passing knowledge of engineering, and he recognized the simple genius of the design. He wrote about it in his official report, not just as a curiosity, but as a practical solution to the challenges of settlement on the northern plains. His report was picked up by a newspaper in the territorial capital. The article, titled "A Prairie Solution to a Prairie Problem," described the Dakota Wall and the sun-facing house, attributing the innovation to the practical wisdom of the settlers in a small, unnamed town. From there, the idea spread. Other small newspapers reprinted the story. Land agents, who sold plots to new settlers, began to include pamphlets with crude drawings of the design, promoting it as a way to survive the harsh climate. The idea, born from a German engineer's notebook and a widow's quiet determination, rippled outward, passed from one builder to another, one family to another, becoming a piece of anonymous folk wisdom that would shape the vernacular architecture of the region for decades. Elara never sought credit or recognition. She lived out her days in the quiet warmth of the house she had built, a respected and beloved figure in the community she had inadvertently transformed. She watched her children grow up strong and healthy, their lives never threatened by the cold that had once been a constant specter. Her legacy was not written in stone or recorded in history books. It was written in the very layout of the town, in the solid, windowless north walls of the homes that stood firm against the winter wind. It was present in the quiet confidence of families who no longer feared the coming of the snow. The great lesson of Prairie Ridge was not about architecture. It was about humility. The settlers learned that the harshest winter was not nearly as dangerous as the stubbornness of a closed mind. They discovered that the most profound wisdom is often found not in loud tradition, but in quiet observation. Not in the strength of arms, but in the courage to admit one was wrong. The hammer of the winter had broken their pride, and in doing so, it had allowed them to build something far stronger in its place. They learned to face the sun.